It was a balmy evening in downtown Arlington, and the lively streets buzzed with conversation and activity as individuals wove in and out of cafes and boutiques. Ethan Wells, a distinguished Navy SEAL on leave, ambled leisurely along the pavement, clad in a plain gray t-shirt, well-tailored jeans and sneakers. A leather satchel was slung over his shoulder. Ethan was heading to a neighborhood bookstore to grab a novel he had been intending to read for the first time in months, his mind finally at ease. Just as Ethan stepped across an intersection, the distinct sound of a police vehicle pulling up disrupted his thoughts. Tires screeched faintly as the car came to a stop. A white police officer, Officer Calloway, stepped out with deliberate lethargy, his piercing blue eyes scrutinizing Ethan like a hawk assessing its prey. "Hey, you!" Calloway barked, his voice slicing through the street's hum. Ethan halted mid-step, turning his head to meet the officer's stare. "In a bit of a rush, aren't you?" Calloway continued, his tone dripping with baseless suspicion. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question lingered in the air, sharp and accusatory. Ethan stayed composed. A few pedestrians slowed their strides, sensing the tension, while others carried on, seemingly accustomed to moments like this. Ethan cocked his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Just heading to the bookstore," he responded evenly. Calloway crossed his arms, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Bookstore, huh? That bag of yours, what's inside? Carrying anything I should know about?" The implication was unmistakable. Ethan felt the weight of onlookers' stares. He could already perceive the prejudice underlying the officer's words, but instead of irritation or fury, something else flickered in Ethan's eyes. Quiet assurance. "You want to check?" Ethan asked, his voice unwavering, almost defiant. Calloway straightened his stance, evidently not expecting that response. "I'll be the one asking questions," he snapped. A brief silence followed as the officer's hand hovered near his utility belt. The crowd subtly thickened, more people pausing, phones discreetly emerging from pockets. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, still relaxed, yet there was something about his demeanor that made Calloway waver. "All right, officer," Ethan spoke again, his tone as composed as before. "Let's do this the right way." The growing audience murmured, their interest piqued by the palpable tension in the air. Ethan's unshaken poise in the face of the officer's implicit threat seemed to unnerve Calloway. The officer squared his shoulders and took a step closer, his boots clicking faintly against the pavement. "Drop the bag," Calloway ordered, his tone now sharper, as if raising his voice might conceal his unease. Ethan remained motionless, his expression giving nothing away. "Sure," he said after a pause, carefully slipping the bag from his shoulder and extending it forward. His composure wasn't submission, it was calculation. As Calloway seized the bag, Ethan's gaze stayed locked onto him. There was no fear in those dark eyes, only a quiet dominance that seemed to further unnerve the officer. "Hands behind your back," Calloway barked, reaching for the cuffs on his belt. At this, Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Am I under arrest?" he inquired, his voice firm and unwavering. "You're being detained," Calloway shot back, sidestepping the direct question. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like a bad joke. A few onlookers exchanged disbelieving glances, and a woman holding her phone muttered, "Here we go again." Ethan gave a slow nod, his lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "All right, Officer Calloway, let me help you out," he said, stepping forward slightly but keeping his movements measured. Calloway tensed, his hand hovering near his holstered firearm. "Stay right there." Ethan halted, raising his hand slightly. "Relax, I'm just giving you my ID." He reached into his back pocket slowly and retrieved a sleek, compact card holder. From it, he extracted his military ID and extended it toward Calloway. The officer hesitated, glancing down at the card. His smirk faltered for the briefest second as his eyes scanned the name, the rank, and the words, United States Navy SEAL engraved on the ID. "You still think I fit the description?" Ethan asked, his tone as composed as ever, but now tinged with subtle amusement. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in closer. Phones were now openly recording, and the air crackled with anticipation. Clearly flustered, Calloway clenched his jaw and tossed the ID back to Ethan. "This doesn't mean you're above suspicion," he muttered. "Stay put while I check your bag." Ethan crossed his arms, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said plenty. Go ahead. Try to dig yourself out of this mess. As Calloway unzipped the bag and began rifling through its contents, Ethan took a slight step back. His calm demeanor now carried a quiet confidence, almost theatrical in its ease. Make sure to show everyone what you find, Ethan remarked, gesturing toward the growing audience. The tension in the air was nearly tangible as Calloway crouched slightly, pulling open the zipper of Ethan's leather messenger bag. The crowd leaned in, their phones locked onto the scene like paparazzi capturing a scandal. Inside, the contents of Ethan's bag were neatly arranged with military precision. A carefully folded book, a stainless steel water bottle, and a sleek black laptop placed side by side. Calloway hesitated for a beat, his fingers brushing the book before pulling it out. What's this? Calloway demanded, holding up the book as if it were contraband. The title, Leadership Under Pressure, A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence, was emblazoned across the front. The irony was lost on Calloway, but not on the murmuring crowd. Ethan's composed expression didn't waver. That's a book I wrote, he said evenly, the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. Calloway blinked, momentarily caught off guard. You wrote this? Calloway repeated, as if the idea was inconceivable. That's what I said, Ethan responded, tilting his head slightly. Want me to sign it for you, or are you just planning to keep digging through my things? A ripple of laughter coursed through the crowd, and Calloway's face darkened with embarrassment. He shoved the book back into the bag with more force than necessary, clearly trying to reassert control over the situation. Cut the attitude, he snapped, his tone now more defensive. This isn't over. Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender. Hey, you're the one making a scene, he said, his voice composed but carrying an unmistakable edge, making it clear he wasn't intimidated. I'm just trying to go about my day. Calloway ignored the remark and resumed rummaging through the bag, pulling out the laptop next. He examined it as if expecting to uncover something incriminating. When that proved fruitless, he set it aside and moved to the last item, a small, leather-bound journal. Opening it, Calloway flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. The journal contained precise, meticulous handwriting, chronicling Ethan's thoughts and experiences from overseas deployments. One particular passage caught Calloway's eye. You don't fight for recognition. You fight because it's the right thing to do. Leadership isn't about power, it's about service. Calloway hesitated for a moment, the words clearly striking a chord he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Meanwhile, the crowd grew more restless. Anything illegal in there, officer? Ethan inquired, his tone polite but laced with a quiet challenge. Calloway snapped the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag, his frustration now evident on his face. You're free to go, he barked, stepping back as if trying to reclaim his authority. Ethan didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. Not so fast, he said, his voice low but commanding. You stopped me? Accused me of matching a description and rifled through my personal belongings in front of all these people. I think we're owed an explanation. The crowd erupted in agreement, voices calling out phrases like, what's the reason? And, you can't just walk away from this. Phones were now pointed directly at Calloway, their owners waiting to capture his next move. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. Ethan stood tall, composed and unyielding, his very presence making it impossible for the officer to dismiss the situation. Calloway's expression wavered between frustration and unease as he glanced at the onlookers encircling him. The sheer number of recording phones seemed to constrict the space around him. His once assured confidence had evaporated, replaced by a dawning awareness that he was now the one under the spotlight. Ethan locked eyes with Calloway, the silence between them stretching like a challenge. You're not going to answer? Ethan asked, his voice cutting effortlessly through the murmur of the crowd. What's this description I supposedly… Calloway opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth was glaringly obvious to everyone watching. There had never been a description, just an excuse. Let me guess, Ethan continued, his tone still calm but now edged with sharpness. Black man walking down the street, minding his own business, that about sum it up? The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs, the tension escalating with every passing second. Calloway's jaw tightened as he struggled to form a response, but Ethan wasn't done. "You see, officer," Ethan said, stepping slightly closer, "what you just did wasn't about keeping the streets safe. It was about power. You thought you could humiliate me, intimidate me, maybe even escalate this into something worse. But you didn't expect me to stay calm, did you?" Calloway's face flushed red, but he remained silent. "You didn't expect me to be a Navy SEAL," Ethan continued, his voice unwavering but cutting. "You didn't expect me to have the discipline to stay level-headed or the experience to see through your game." The crowd hung on every word, some cheering softly, others nodding in agreement. Ethan turned slightly, addressing the growing audience. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "It's about the countless times this happens to people who don't have a camera watching, who don't have the training or the platform to push back. This isn't justice. It's harassment. And it needs to stop." The crowd responded with applause, their voices rising in support. Calloway, now visibly shaken, attempted to interject. I was just doing my job," he stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. Ethan turned back to him, his expression one of quiet disappointment. "If this is how you define your job, maybe you're not cut out for it," he said simply. The words hit Calloway like a slap, and the crowd roared in agreement. People began calling out phrases like "hold him accountable" and "file a complaint." Calloway looked around, his authority crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up. "Here's the deal, officer," he said. "You're going to stand here in front of all these people and explain why you stopped me, or—" He let the implication hang in the air as he tapped his phone screen. Calloway's eyes widened as he realized Ethan had been recording the entire interaction. The officer opened his mouth, but again, no words came out. "You don't owe me an apology," Ethan added, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You owe every single person here an explanation for why you thought you could abuse your power. So go ahead, talk." The crowd fell silent, waiting for Calloway's response. The officer's face was pale now, his earlier arrogance completely drained away. He shifted on his feet, clearly panicking under the weight of the moment. The weight of the moment bore down on Officer Calloway. Like a storm cloud, the crowd's expectant silence intensified his unease. Beads of sweat gathered on his brow as he searched for an escape from the corner he had backed himself into. Calloway stammered, his gaze flickering between Ethan and the sea of recording phones. "I was acting on suspicion. Just doing my duty, trying to ensure public safety." The crowd groaned, the flimsy excuse sparking murmurs of frustration and disbelief. A man near the front shook his head, muttering, "Same old story," while a woman called out, "What suspicion? Say it plainly." Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but his presence seemed to swell with authority. He took a measured step closer, his steady gaze locking onto Calloway's flustered face. "Suspicion?" Ethan repeated, his voice slicing through the noise like a razor. "Let me make this clear, officer. Suspicion is not a license to harass. It's not an excuse to stop someone without cause. And it's certainly not justification for targeting someone because of the color of their skin." Calloway opened his mouth to reply, but Ethan raised a hand, silencing him. The crowd erupted in soft cheers at the display of quiet dominance. "You want to talk about suspicion?" Ethan continued, his voice rising slightly, his tone sharpening. "What about the fact that you didn't ask anyone else on the street where they were going? What about the fact that you singled me out, rifled through my belongings, and tried to paint me as a threat, all without a shred of evidence?" Calloway's face burned red, his composure unraveling under the weight of Ethan's words. I wasn't singling you out," he sputtered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "Weren't you?" Ethan shot back, his calm demeanor now carrying the weight of righteous fury. "Because I don't see anyone else here being stopped. Or are you going to tell us all that they fit the same vague description you mentioned?" The crowd erupted in agreement, some shouting, "Answer him!" "And we see right through you." Calloway looked like a cornered animal, his former arrogance now completely replaced by desperation. His eyes darted to the crowd, to the phones capturing his every move, then back to Ethan, who stood tall and unyielding. Ethan lowered his voice, his tone softening, but losing none of its impact. "Here's the truth, Officer Calloway. You didn't expect me to push back. You thought you could get away with this because you've done it before. Probably more times than you can count." He took one last step forward, his words deliberate. "But not today. Today, you picked the wrong person.